Labadiena, mėly televizijos žiūrovai. Pernelyg dažnai Rytų Europa traktuojama kaip pasyvus regionas, o Rytų europiečiai kaip antrarūšiai, pabrėžia Fabio Belafatti, italų akademikas, kuris dirba Vilniaus universitete ir čia studijuoja mūsų regioną. Sveiki, Fabio, ir iš karto žiūrovams įspėju, kad bendrausime anglų kalbą, bet jūs girdėsite vertimą. So, hello Fabio, thank you for joining us here in this studio, and I would like to start by asking how did you come up with this idea when it comes to Eastern Europe, that you say that it is worth to compare those studies in Europe, post-colonial studies, and on one hand, on the other hand, those studies of Eastern Europe, which are usually labeled as post-communism studies. So can you give us a presentation of this basic idea? How did you came up with this?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Technically speaking, I'm not a scholar of post-colonial studies, and I haven't applied a full set of post-colonial studies to the case of Eastern Europe. There is a very, very rich literature, as you surely know, on that topic. When it comes to my research specifically, I work on the concept of Orientalism as devised by Edward Said, which is considered to be one of the foundations of post-colonial studies, but at the same time distances itself from them, in the sense that post-colonial studies have occasionally been accused of falling into the problem of cultural essentialism. So this issue that countries, social realities, groups get defined on the basis of certain elements, which are then elevated to the level of their very essence, and then everything else gets essentially missed out. Whereas Edward Said's Orientalism in itself is precisely the opposite. It is a whole reflection on the problem of cultural essentialism and how this needs to be avoided if we are to achieve a proper understanding of reality. So in that sense, Said both established post-colonial studies in many ways, and simultaneously also posed the foundations of the contradiction within post-colonial studies themselves. When it comes to post-colonial societies and post-socialist, post-communist, post-Soviet countries, my reflection focuses precisely on how they are described in Western European and American media, policy-making circles and so on, with the terminology, the vocabulary, and the stereotypes that are typical of Orientalist narratives. So these concept that you mentioned of being active or passive is a pretty big component of the critique of Orientalism that Said made. Western colonial powers have tended to see the Orient, the East, Said talks about the Muslim Middle East primarily, as a passive entity on which Western countries have essentially a right of agency, whereas the local peoples and the local social organizations are stuck in some kind of frozen past that never really changes unless there is some kind of push from the outside. And I see that very, very much in the way Eastern Europe and, well, broadly speaking, the post-communist world is described. There are, I believe, some problems when it comes to the application of post-colonial studies in general to the case of the post-Soviet world, in particular because of this issue of cultural essentialism and the problem of authenticity, which is very closely associated to that. A lot of post-colonial studies applied to Eastern Europe tend to focus on what is authentic in Eastern Europe, on problems like the mimicry, phenomena such as the supposed imitation of the West by local people. I, alongside Said and following in his footsteps, I reject the very idea that there is something called East, West, Eastern Europe, Western Europe. These are social constructs, and because of that, obviously the question of authenticity, mimicry, and so on is not particularly relevant for me. What is really relevant for me is the narrative, the way in which Eastern European peoples and countries are essentially diminished, subject to endless stereotypization in Western media and policymaking circles. So that, I believe, is the most important.
So you came up with this in the public sphere during Ukrainian crisis.
Yes.
So can you explain us something?
Yes, this was when the Ukrainian crisis started. I didn't have a very clear position on the topic. I have to say, possibly I was more understanding of the Russian position at the beginning. I read a series of articles, and then I noticed that there was a common problem in pretty much all of the coverage that took Russia's side in the whole affair. Whenever somebody was defending Russia's position in the Ukraine crisis, the Ukrainians were always passive. These happened, of course, in Russian media, but also in Western European and American media. And that made me realize that there is probably a methodological problem behind that, that biases the very way in which we talk about this topic. And then from that, obviously, I shifted to much more pro-Ukrainian positions, as it's almost unavoidable. Because once you start realizing that, no, the Ukrainians do have an agency, they are not, puppets of the West, as pro-Russian commentators have often suggested, then obviously the entire Russian propaganda about the crisis starts slowly falling apart. I was, to be honest, very, very saddened during the crisis to see that even people that I know, that I've collaborated with in the past, fell victims of this kind of narrative, of this kind of bias, and always described the entire crisis just as a clash between the US on the one side, with the EU on the second level, and Russia on the other side, and Ukraine just as a battlefield. And that is a problem. It's an oversimplistic assessment. It's an oversimplistic approach. It means essentially losing everything that is going on the ground. And it is precisely what Edward Said was criticizing about the Orientalist approach, is this vision that there is a European actor or an imperial actor, which in the case of Ukraine would be Russia and or America or European Union, depending on the narrative, and passive local subjects, essentially. I think the subjects should actually be regarded as active, and we should focus on their activity in the whole affair.
Something similar could be applied to us as well. For example, when we talk of NATO expansion,
Yes.
not us joining NATO. So my question would be, because since it might be applied for Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and also Poland, because Polish people also joined NATO, joined the EU, but especially during these years, the Polish government, when conservatives came into the power, they always tried to stress that they are very active. They are like always in the opposition to the European Union, which they say is German-dominated, and things like that. So I would like to ask you, back then when you write it on Ukraine, so did you have any idea about this, that this might happen to Polish people? And do you think that they are now active in the way that they are their own masters? What do you think about this Polish situation when it comes to playing against Brussels artificially sometimes?
Yeah, I'll start first with a quick remark about NATO, because it's very interesting that you raised precisely this problem. Because as a teenager in Italy, that was I was very politicized, as many teenagers are in Italy, and NATO expansion was one of the first topics with which over which we clashed. And I remember since that time that the entire debate and the entire discourse was framed in terms of expansion, enlargement, and so on. And
like we are moving.
Exactly, we are moving there, and obviously there was a lot of opposition in terms of, now this is, it's Russia's lands, this is Russia's business, we should not interfere, because, and in reality, as we know, there was an enormous amount of agency going from the Eastern European countries themselves, to actually be allowed to join NATO and the European Union. In 1993, I believe, Professor Anatol Levin published a book called The Baltic Revolution, in which he talks about the aspiration of some Lithuanian politicians to one day join NATO. And he dismissed it as essentially as a joke, with also a bit of Orientalist sense of superiority towards these lesser peoples of Eastern Europe that would like to access our fancy club. A few years later, he was proven wrong, but he was proven wrong because there was, well, first of all, because there was a favorable context that allowed it, but also because the Eastern European states very, very actively lobbied and worked to be able to join these communities of nation. When it comes to Poland specifically,
just for that, because since you mentioned your teenager year, so it's very interesting to ask which position. How did you yourself see things within your friends and?
Well, back then I would say there were two positions. There was the Silvio Berlusconi government was in power at that time, and he was quite favorable to expansion. But I would say the opposition to NATO enlargement was quite widespread across different political divides. It depended very much. At that time, I was quite radical, and I was against NATO altogether. So obviously, I was against its enlargement on the basis of principle. Then obviously, I've changed my mind pretty drastically and radically, because once you grow up, then you learn a few things about life. But yeah, I remember that this argument that that Eastern Europe belongs to Russia essentially, and that it's Russia's sphere of influence, and that we should not interfere there, was very common. And that is, I think, the core of the issue. It's a reflection of an imperial narrative. Russia had and still has, unfortunately, this pretty strong imperial narrative, this concept of the near abroad, which is essentially a modern interpretation of the idea of sphere of influence. And you had Western European countries that had a colonial imperialist past, found that narrative to be very appealing, and it resonated very, very easily among our audiences in Western Europe, simply because most likely we as population and as policymakers were much more likely to identify with the former imperial power than with the subjects, because we used to be imperialist countries. So
yeah, let's get back to Poland.
I think the question is needs to be rephrased a little bit. Poland has always been active. My argument is precisely that Western analysis of Eastern Europe tend to underestimate the agency of the local actors. But Poland has always been active. It's always been a very active member of Euro-Atlantic organizations. What we see nowadays with these clash between Brussels and the PIS government in Warsaw is not really the agency of Poland, which has always been there. It's the agency of a certain section of Polish society, which the government claims to represent. And I think here's where the problem of cultural essentialism becomes really relevant, because we should not make the mistake of assuming that that government or the factions within Polish society that government represents is Poland. It is simply one of the many Polands that exists within the country. You have a whole range of political views and different social groups and social grievances. And they all have equal agency and equal right to define themselves as Poland. It shouldn't be just the monopoly of the far-right party that is currently in power in Poland. So in that sense, I believe the Poles have always been active. They've always had agency. What we see nowadays is simply that a certain group within society is becoming more active, and we see that there is a disagreement with the European institutions. But I wouldn't really overestimate that. I mean, after all, the European Union has done very little so far in terms of reining in the Polish government or the Hungarian government, Viktor Orbán before that. I mean, we've seen many times in the last few years the rhetoric on the one side, Hungary needs to get its freedom of the press situation right, but then at the same time we see a lot of coziness between, for example, Jean-Claude Juncker and Viktor Orbán. You may remember that from the video where he greeted him.
Jokes.
Sorry?
Joking to each other.
Exactly, joking to each other and greeting him, oh, hey, here's the dictator. Personally, I think if Europe has to be a union of values, and if it really was a union of values, Hungary should have been kicked out a long time ago. And Poland should be subject to significant sanctions because essentially the state media have now lost almost all objectivity. They are almost entirely controlled by the government, and they are used as tools to attack the opposition, which is something that in a democratic society is not really acceptable. But the fact that this is, it's a clash between one section of the Polish society, or it could be the Hungarian society, or it could be the Lithuanian society, if we will have a similar government in the future, versus other sectors of the Polish society itself. This is an internal clash. It's a clash between worldviews. Then you have the European Union also pushing for in certain directions, but the way I see it, very weakly and definitely not sufficiently. But this is an internal matter, in which you have different worldviews among Polish political forces that are clashing. And obviously the PIS government wants us very much to think that this is a clash between them and the European Union, because it's always very easy to point at an external enemy. And the European Union is a very weak external enemy because it generally doesn't really...
Exactly, what you say is very interesting, because it seems to me that Kaczynski and his conservatives, they really understand this narrative of superior Western Europeans and lesser Eastern Europeans. I mean, he's talking about feelings, how
Yes.
the Eastern Europeans might feel, some of them. So so in this context, what would you advise to do for European Union? You said it's a very weak enemy, and truly, because if it's internal matters, it's the Polish country which decides its policy. But what to do to European Union? Because I mean, there are many initiatives to organize help and things like that. So how would you see these things?
I think first of all we need a change, a long-term change in terms of the way we talk about Poland, because or Eastern Europe in general. Because yes, Kaczynski you're right. He understands very well how the whole media narrative works. He understands very well that Poland makes it on the global news if something happens that matches with the stereotype. And the stereotype is generally an idea of the Poles as backward, very conservative, fanatically Catholics, anti-Semitic, and more or less fascist. That is one of the key features of the stereotype. He knows that, and he has been engaging in a lot of provocative actions to trigger international media to talk about Poland precisely in those terms. This was seen with the nationalist march took place a few days ago. It is rumored that actually it was the government that actively encouraged neo-Nazi groups to take part in the march in very large numbers, precisely because they knew that this would trigger a certain kind of narrative. And then once you have the global media presenting these once again this narrative of Poles as fascists, then you can start playing the external enemy card. You see, we are the defenders of Poland versus these external media, the foreign media, the European Union, which constantly criticize us and are constantly bashing us. And you can see the difference, for example, at least I could see it in Italian media, between the way in which the nationalist march was covered and the way in which the huge demonstrations in favor of the rule of law, the separation of powers, and women's rights in Poland were covered. There was some coverage of those as well, but the nationalist march was covered enormously more, which is, I mean, understandable. That was a very, very serious accident and it needed to be covered. But the rest needs to be covered as well. It needs to be made clear to the Western European audience that there isn't just one Poland that is the conservative Kaczynski government. There is an entire nation there with a whole range of different opinions. And if you look actually at the scale of the demonstrations against the government over women's rights and over separation of powers, those were among the largest demonstrations we've seen in Europe in a long time. And I strongly doubt that there will be similar scale demonstrations in Western Europe over such issues. Yeah, there will probably be a lot of mobilization on Facebook and people sharing posts, but not much more than that. That the agency of that section of the Polish society was, I wouldn't say forgotten or ignored, but definitely wasn't given the same kind of coverage as the nationalists, because that part doesn't fit in the narrative, doesn't fit in the stereotype. The European Union, what can the European Union do? Because of course, changing the media narrative takes years. But what can
it seems to me that they are really afraid of saying things, because they know that this narrative is activated. And then if they say something more stricter, or if they say that now we will really be more active towards you, then they will say, you see, those Europeans, imperialists and things like that. Yeah,
well, I don't envy European policymakers, of course, because it is not an easy position. Of course, they need to engage. They need to make it clear that this is primarily about universal and common values. I mean, I don't think that any country or any group can claim exclusive ownership over certain things. Separation of powers, liberal values, human rights, democracy, and so on. This is not something that belongs to us Western Europeans, because I had no part in devising them. My ancestors definitely did not. They were peasants somewhere in the north of Italy. We simply claim ownership on such concepts on the basis of the fact that we imagine ourselves as belonging to the same community as the people that came up with those ideas. But Poland itself has its history of constitutionalism. As you know, the Polish constitution, right before the third partition, a long history of struggle for freedom, independence, and human rights. So it's impossible really to claim, as conservative or right-wing forces in Eastern Europe do, that these are Western values that are being imposed onto us. These are not Western values. These are values that are there for anyone to take, essentially, and that in which a significant proportion of their own society recognizes itself with. So how can they claim these are not Polish values as well, that democracy is not a Polish value? I mean, the largest pro-democracy demonstrations in the 20th century were those against communism, and a significant part of it was played by the Poles, by the Czechs, by the Baltic peoples, and so on. So these are definitely their values as much as Brussels' values. So I don't necessarily see a problem in the European Union insisting on these aspects. But what I see a lot is this kind of patronizing attitude of we teach you what to do, and that obviously plays into the hands of the PIS government, because they can say, you see, this is them telling us what to do and imposing us their values against our own will. But the will of the Polish people is the will of those who voted for the PIS, but also the will of the millions of people that have demonstrated against this government and in the last few months. They are equally Poland.
So the other question would be the other from the past. Do you think it was a mistake for Western European countries to allow Eastern European countries to join European Union? Because it was really clear that when it comes to economy, the differences are huge. When it comes to democracy, okay, back then there were kind of lots of progress, lots of hopes, but still democracy is not functioning as well as in Western Europe. So maybe they should give us 20 more years just to prove that we are that we might use those universal principles that you talked before. What is your opinion? I'm asking this question because, you know, what is interesting for me is I think about Ukrainian people. They could not join European Union, and they had not experienced lots of immigration because the borders were more closer, and then they themselves, they had to fight for democracy themselves, like Orange Revolution, Maidan, things like that. And my guess would be, it's only a guess, that since we had this huge immigration from Lithuania, lots of people moved away. So the critical groups that could do something similar, like in Ukraine, protest, things like that, we lack people of this because they are in Europe. This is my argument. So what do you think about the question about mistake?
Well, there is a lot of truth to what you say about the migration factor. I mean, this is usually a safety valve for social unrest in a lot of countries. My main area of study alongside Eastern Europe is Central Asia, and Central Asia is a case in point in how migration keeps entire regimes in place, because, you know, the potential troublemakers simply go somewhere else. I don't think it was a mistake. I mean, I think the benefit in terms of the possibility to create something like the European Union, like the largest community of countries that has ever existed, that voluntarily joined, which is an important distinction, otherwise it would be the Soviet Union. This is an enormous benefit. We tend to forget the reason why the European Union was created, Second World War, the complete devastation of the continent. The fact that we were able all together to come up with something like the European Union, with this community of nations, and expand it, or, you know, be in a way
open,
being forced by Eastern European countries to welcome them, by itself, this is an enormous benefit. Then we could discuss perhaps about the economic dimensions. You know, that of course for us Italians, for example, maybe it was not a fantastic deal in the sense that a lot of the EU structural funds that used to go to the south of Italy were then diverted to Eastern Europe because it was poorer. But overall, I mean, it worked out pretty fine. There were lots of companies that invested in Eastern Europe to the benefit of, you know, our own country's GDP at the end of the day. So we could discuss the economic aspects of it, but I think in terms of the possibility to create something like the European Union is in itself such an achievement and such a positive step towards peace, which we now give for granted, but my grandparent definitely did not. That by itself overshadows any possible problems that may have derived from the EU enlargement.
Now I would like to ask about the Arab Spring and the European Union position when all those protests emerged and followed. So do you think that because of this narrative of superiority of European Union and other passive regions, do you think that Europeans were like afraid to take more active steps when it comes to like Arab Spring? Because Arab Spring had so many hopes, and now it's basically only Tunisia that is democracy, and all those other countries, Libya, Syria, there was a huge failure, and Egypt, they came back to dictatorship. Do you think there was something that European Union could do, if at all could do, and do you think they were afraid to do?
Well, yes. I mean, when it comes to the Middle East, North Africa, there was first of all the problem of Iraq, this big elephant in the room that nobody really talked about, but it didn't go spectacularly well when the US and some European allies decided to invade Iraq. So there was obviously very, very strong awareness that that kind of stuff probably is not going to work. I think, however, I mean, we need to look at the whole issue with the Arab Spring in a broader perspective, I believe. The narrative, the rhetoric nowadays is one of they had their opportunity, they blew it, it didn't work out. Now, you know, they've failed. Their democratization attempts have failed. We need, however, to bear in mind one thing. When we compare the Muslim world, which is again a very socially constructive concept with the Christian world. First of all, we need to bear in mind that what we call the Muslim world is roughly 600 years younger than us, but we still see, the kind of debates that existed in Europe a century ago, or even 50 years ago. We have seen them in the Muslim world as well already in the 19th century and early 20th century. Then there was obviously this huge problem of colonialism, which essentially removed any possibility to actually have a debate. But the first constitutional protests, demonstrations, riots that took place in Iran at the beginning of the 20th century, pro-independence movements for self-determination and a more democratic form of government started in Egypt at the beginning of the 20th century as well. So if we look at the entire trajectory of the history of European democracy, we tend to look at it as a triumphant walk towards a brighter future, and then finally we've arrived, we've created democratic societies, that's it. In reality, democracy in our own society is extremely fragile, and I think the Trump administration is proving it very seriously. The rise of the far right is proving it. Until 70 years ago, a significant part of Western Europe was not democratic at all. We Western Europeans have invented totalitarianism and fascism, which is not exactly something we should be very proud of. So if you look at these in this other perspective, what you see is essentially 2,000 years of European history and European failures in creating a democratic system, followed by a few decades of very, very, very fragile relative success, which is now being undermined in several countries. If you look at our situation in that perspective, then the supposed failure of the Arab Spring acquires a different meaning. It's a process of trial and error. And as we have tried and failed many, many times throughout history, same I think we can allow also our Mediterranean neighbors to also make mistakes and not necessarily get it right with the first large-scale attempt. What the European Union should have done in that context is a really, really hard question. I think what they did in Libya was probably the right thing, intervening to stop at least the worst cases of crimes against humanity. In Syria, the Syrian revolution failed, but it failed primarily because of the fact that Assad relied on Russian and Iranian support. So it's not really the fault of the Syrians themselves. You can't blame them. Same goes for Egypt. I mean, the regime that took power is essentially just a different version of the previous military-based regime that existed under Mubarak. So it still had the same kind of political resources and capital that Mubarak had in terms of ability to control society, repressive power, and so on. And that kind of power, that kind of tools is something that to a large extent was provided by Western countries. So we need to be very well aware of that. Whenever we talk about what should we do to help, I strongly believe that the first thing we should do would be to stop doing harm. In terms of supporting dictators all around the world. I think the case of the Panama Paper and the Paradise Papers have exposed very, very clearly how European countries have a very, very direct role in supporting authoritarian regimes, keeping them in power, and how we benefit and profit from the transfer of funds that authoritarian elites operate from their state budget essentially into their own private accounts. There was an interesting estimation made by among others, the Norwegian School of Economics, compared the amount of aid that is provided by the West to third world countries with the amount of financial resources that flow from third world countries to the West. And the ratio is completely imbalanced. We pride ourselves of the aid that we provide, but in reality, we receive a lot more resources than we give. It's a ratio of $3.3 trillion versus $1.3 trillion. And a lot of these is money that authoritarian leaders steal from their state budget and launder through Western tax havens or friendly judicial systems like, say, the Netherlands or Britain's and so on and so forth. We should start from that. I think that, that by itself would be a step much larger than any aid we've been providing so far. Let's maybe start from that and deprive these authoritarian systems of the support that they get from us, and then we will see. Then it will be up to the local populations, and they will be free to choose how they want to organize their future. But let's start by doing no harm to begin with.
You mentioned two narratives before as you spoke, Muslim world, Christian world. So I would like to ask you, because here in Eastern Europe, it's really, especially here in Lithuania, it's really a popular argument that was raised by a former pope that, Europe has its Christian roots, and those principles that you spoke before, like democracy, human rights, and those things like that, not as much as they are universal, but because they are very connected with the Christian roots. So I would like to ask, what do you think about this argument, since you are from Italy, which is also a Catholic country, and you live now quite a while here in Lithuania, which is also a Catholic country. So do you see any differences, like how it is understood in Italy or in Western Europe, this Christian past, and how it is understood here, especially when it comes to like identity of the nation, of Lithuanian nation, of Italian nation, and Europe itself?
Yeah, well, I'll begin by saying that I do not agree with the idea that freedom, democracy, and human rights originate from Christianity. Yes, there were some Christian thinkers who contributed in different ways to the development of ideas that would later become the concept of human rights, but there were also lots of Christian thinkers that were on completely opposite opinion. It's just that, because at the end, these kind of ideas have gained traction and have become, fortunately, hegemonic. Now, obviously, they want to jump on the bandwagon and say, yeah, it was us all along. It's because of us. I don't think that is the case for a very simple reason. And then we go back to your question, that I don't think we can really talk about something like the Muslim world or the Christian world as entities. There is just so much diversity within each of these two blocks that you can't simply generalize, or you can't define one line of thought, one line of Christian thought that ended up producing a certain result. If we look, for example, at Italy and Lithuania, I see a lot of differences, but I see the same differences within Italian society as well. I mean, Italian Catholicism has always been characterized by an extremely broad range of diverse positions. We go from the essentially Catholic fascism and far-right ultra-conservatism all the way to something that we called Cattocomunismo, which is like communist Catholicism, which is the way in which some Catholic thinkers during the time of the First Republic after the Second World War that were very, very keen on emphasizing the importance of things like social justice and social equality, were sort of mocked and called as half Catholic and half communists. There is just so much diversity within those positions that you can't really generalize, and I think the same applies to Lithuania. I have many Lithuanian friends who are Catholics, and each of them is Catholic in a different way. If we really want to define some common trends, I do believe that perhaps here in Lithuania, religion seems to play a role in terms of as an identity marker, as one of the components of national identity. At the same time, on the one side you see churches full of young people who clearly take a pride in their Catholic identity, but at the same time you can see that there is a very close connection with Lithuanianness, being Catholic because you are Lithuanian, and that translates in some rather bizarre situations, like when we used to go to church before my child was born, and we ran out of free time with my wife, and we used to go to a church where there was a very progressive priest with whom I would agree almost on everything, despite the fact that I'm not religious, and he would conclude his sermons by, blessing the fatherland, and that for me was quite bizarre, because on the one side, I mean, he's clearly on what in Western Europe would have called left-wing positions. At the same time, he's very patriotic. So you can see in these kind of expressions, and I see that in the way many of my Lithuanian friends express their religious identity, that yeah, it serves as one of the components of national identity, but then beyond that, the door is open to pretty much any different position, from the most conservative to the most progressive ones. And there are also, in that sense, I think also Lithuania is perhaps more secularized, and this, I believe, partly has to do with the Soviet experience, in the sense that despite the strong religious feeling of a lot of Lithuanians, there are a few things that you wouldn't really touch. Nobody talks about, like abolishing, for example, freedom of choice, abortion rights, except for some very fringe groups. Women's rights are something that there is a pretty strong consciousness about. Lithuanian women are very empowered compared with the situation we have in Italy. I think if you look at the latest gender equality assessment, there's a massive gap between Lithuania and Italy. Religion in Italy, well, I mean, my grandmother was Catholic in a way, my grandfather is Catholic in a different way, so it's really hard to point at general features. I think actually probably it's a religion that is derivative of culture rather than culture that is derivative of religion. And that, I think, is, I mean, in a way we are influenced a lot by Max Weber in the way in which we look at religion as something that determines everything else. Max Weber and the concept of the Protestant ethics of capitalism, and this idea that Protestantism is what produced capitalism. That kind of mentality, I think, has had a very negative impact in our ability to understand and assess religion. And I think in reality is probably cultural specificities and local features that then influence the way in which religions are lived, seen, interpreted, accepted or not accepted. I don't think, for example, that Northern Europe became capitalist and democratic because of Protestantism. I think that it became like that because of certain features in local culture, perhaps, that were also conducive to the Protestant Reformation, differently from what it was in Southern Europe. I don't like to overemphasize the importance of religion in shaping society. I think it is society that shapes religion in many ways, and I think this applies to Lithuania and Italy and their relationship with Catholic.
Okay, Fabio, this will be my last question, as our time is going to the end. Just to sum up our conversation, what do you think about, like, are you optimistic on this thing? That do you think that we as Lithuanians, as a country, might change this narrative of unequal Europeans? Are you optimistic? And I know that you also made many efforts yourself with the academic field. You organized a conference. So do you see any changes already after those years? Because Ukrainian crisis was 3 years ago. So what do you think, just summing up?
No, I'm not very optimistic, I have to say. I'm actually quite pessimistic on this point. I think the two things have made me extremely pessimistic. One is the Trump administration, Trump's remarks about the irrelevance of NATO, this idea that we should get away with it. Let's be honest, he would have never said that if it wasn't for Eastern Europe and Russia. He had in mind Eastern Europe and Russia when he made those remarks. He's asking the question that a lot of Western Europeans and Americans have been asking. Why should we defend Eastern Europe? And this is a question that originates from the fact that we tend to look at Eastern Europe as a second-class Europe. So that was source of strong pessimism for me. The other one was Brexit. And I remember right before the conference, which you mentioned, which took place in 2015, we met with a group of prominent Lithuanian scholars to discuss the concept of the conference. And I was making the case that racism against Eastern Europeans is one of the key components in creating this narrative of Eastern Europeans as second-class citizens, second-class Europeans, and therefore as a region that you can essentially give up on because it belongs to Russia. And the reaction from these colleagues, Lithuanian colleagues, was amusement, and they laughed at me and said, "No, come on, this is nonsense." And less than a year later, we had Brexit, and Brexit was to a very, very large extent caused by racism against Romanians, Bulgarians, Poles, among British society. And on the one side, it feels nice to be vindicated. At the same time, it was a terrible feeling because I wish it would have not been like that, of course. So I'm not very optimistic about the general direction. What Lithuania needs to do, well, first of all, is to cooperate with the other countries in Eastern Europe to realize the scale of the problem. Because you have a problem when you have governments, for example, that have, like Italy's government, that have pseudo-academic advisors invited to speak with their ambassadors or at government-sponsored events that argue that we should essentially establish a completely pro-Russian foreign policy. That is a problem, obviously, and I think Eastern European policymakers don't always realize the scale of the issue. So there needs to be cooperation in terms of establishing a common narrative. I think there also needs to be ability to learn a little bit, perhaps, the vocabulary, what I call the anti-imperialist vocabulary. Eastern European countries have adopted very successfully a liberal or even neoliberal vocabulary, but they rarely use, for example, the concept of Russia as an imperialist country. A significant part of the problem of Eastern Europe as being seen as a second-class Europe is that a lot of this narrative comes from the left, not just the far left, but the left and the center left as well. At least that section of Western European society is very reactive to the concept of imperialism. That should be used. It should be employed as a rhetorical tool, because this is what we're talking about. We're talking about a form of new imperialism by a country that alone among the former colonial powers is the only one that hasn't really lost its empire. So that needs to be pointed out, and Lithuania, I think, needs to leverage on skillfully leverage on the sense of guilt among Western European countries for their colonial past, and try to crack these implicit sympathy that exists between Western European countries and Russia as a former colonial power and imperial power.
Fabio Belafatti, ačiū labai už labai įdomų pokalbį. Ačiū žiūrovams už jūsų dėmesį ir kviečiu susitikti po savaitės. Sudie.